has a straight edge on it, so it's very easy. And maybe in our world here, there lives a happy little mountain.
Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime videos. I do mystery disappearances, murders, psychological experiment videos, anything along those lines, as well as a little bit of university and lifestyle related videos sprinkled in where I can. Today I'm back with day number 2, I believe, of my true crime week. So if you didn't know, I'm uploading a true crime video every day of this week, Monday to Sunday, so clear your schedules because I will be uploading a new video every single day. Today I'm back discussing a case from a slightly different perspective. I've had this researched for so long, and typically I will focus on something from the point of an individual victim, sort of the case and the incident surrounding the actual victim themselves, as opposed to from the attackers. But this time around I'm going to be talking about a relatively recent serial killer, and she had a lot of victims, so I'm going to go through each one, what she did to each one, every potential victim, every death, every near death, all of it, as well as a little bit about her background and what happened after she was caught. So this particular serial killer, like I said, was relatively recent, and I'm sure that if you are in the UK you will have probably heard this name at some point, or at least heard of some of her crimes. Today we're going to be talking about Beverley Allitt. She was coined the Angel of Death by media reports because she was an active child killer in the UK. I think she attacked a total of 13 children. She successfully killed 4 of them. And yeah, so if you want to hear a little bit about the entire timeline, then keep on watching and we shall just get started. I would also like to apologise just very quickly if you can hear any noises in the background. There usually is noises in all of my videos, unfortunately, because I film in front of a window and I can't edit out all the loud noises all the time. But today it is honestly tipping it down. I'm so worried that you can hear like the rain, so I'm sorry if you can. The lighting isn't great, but yes, I'm really sorry about that. So like I said, Beverley Allitt was an active child killer in the UK. She killed 4 children and attacked 13 in the span of only a couple months. It was maybe about 2 months the majority of these murders occurred, which is absolutely insane. Beverley Allitt was born Beverley Gail Allitt, and she was born in a village called Corby Glen just outside of Grantham, UK. She was born on the 4th of October 1968. She had 2 sisters and 1 brother, and in early life her and her family didn't really have a lot of money. Her dad worked full-time in an off-licence shop, her mum worked as a school cleaner, so from a young age they weren't ridiculously poor, but they weren't by all means well off. Outside of school hours, Beverley would volunteer. She would help out the local families. She would volunteer to babysit for the children. It wouldn't always be for money, it was just sort of, she wanted to go into childcare, as a lot of young girls do. But then by the time she was 16, she had dropped out of school and she began training full-time to be a nurse. So that kind of just very quick little summary is often what you will come across if you decide to research Beverley Allitt yourself. It's kind of like the initial things that that most people know about her, but there are some accounts from people who knew Beverley Allitt from a young age who suggest that this isn't the full story, and there was a lot more negative things that would happen on behalf of Beverley while she was growing up. So the main thing that is extremely notable, and kind of it's more important when you go to the end of the video, so when you learn about the more of her actions later on in life, they are reflected in a lot of her behaviours in early life as well, and obviously they weren't necessarily ridiculously strange as a child. It was kind of just strange-ish behaviours from a child. So when she was young, from a very young age, she would learn to dress herself and give herself like plasters, bandages. She'd even make fake casts for kind of wounds, ailments, things that she didn't actually have. So she would a lot of the time would bandage up an appendage of hers for no reason. Many people just kind of believe this was a behaviour that she had adapted just from being a young girl who did want to work with people, like in childcare and things. So this sort of behaviour isn't necessarily really strange for a young girl at the time, because, you know, they may have just seen it as her wanting to go into the medical profession, which obviously she ended up doing. But also she was one of 4 siblings, so a lot of people just put it down to her wanting to get attention away from her siblings, and this was the only way she knew how. However, these little attention-seeking behaviours that she kind of displayed in early childhood didn't stay this way for long. As she grew up, she displayed more and more aggressive and attention-seeking behaviours, and she even eventually became rapidly overweight. So a combination of all of these things made her a very ill-behaved, aggressive and hard-to-handle child. As she got older as well, these behaviours where she would fake these wounds and illnesses became a lot worse, and she became more and more of a hypochondriac. So she would spend a lot of time in and out of hospitals claiming to have some really painful ailment that she didn't actually have. It even got to a point where she managed to convince doctors that she was in so much pain that she needed to have her appendix removed, but it was actually completely unnecessary. She didn't have appendicitis, but she managed to get it removed because obviously if a child is complaining that much, they're gonna think something's wrong, so they removed her appendix. Then not only this, but after the surgery of removing her appendix, she would constantly provoke her scar, so her doctors would come in finding her picking out the stitches, pulling it apart just to make it worse and prevent it from healing, just so she could spend more and more time in hospitals. She was known to jump doctors once one would sort of catch on to this hypochondriac attention-seeking behaviours and deny her treatment, because obviously there wasn't really anything wrong with her. She would then just move on to the next one and keep going until it was necessary to move on. During her training as a nurse, there were a lot of quite strange occurrences that would happen in all the different places that she would do her training in, so the places she would kind of work in, but nothing that ever really could be pinned on her necessarily, because they were all just kind of little strange things that could potentially be put down to other explanations. So one in particular was something that happened in a nursing home that she'd been doing her training in, so she'd been looking after kind of the elderly. Another member of staff there had walked into a room one day and found feces smeared all over the walls. There were many suspicions that it was Beverley because she was kind of quite trouble-seeking in some ways, but there was no way to ever pin it on them, and also it could have just been put down to an ill patient maybe having some sort of episode, so nothing was ever pinned on her. But yeah, these were quite strange things, strange little things that were notable during her time in her training. She also had an extremely high absence rate from her training days because, like I said, she was a hypochondriac, so she would always be claiming that she needed more and more time off for some new ailment. Her boyfriend at the time also said that she had been particularly aggressive towards him during their relationship. She'd even gone as far to make fake rape allegations against him, and also claimed that she was pregnant when she actually wasn't. So it's all these, again, attention-seeking, aggressive behaviours that she was displaying throughout her lives in kind of every aspect of her life. In addition to her poor attendance at her training days, she also failed the majority of her nursing exams because, like I said, she was barely there and she wasn't really that interested in it. A lot of the time she was either causing trouble or she was faking an illness, so she failed her exams. But despite this, she did manage to land herself a 6-month working contract in a Lincolnshire hospital, because this particular hospital was so understaffed, like they were desperate to get anything they could, anyone working there. So she had a 6-month temporary contract working with them. And here in this hospital, she began working on Children's Ward 4, which is something you'll hear throughout the video because this was the ward that she was placed on. And one thing that I want you to bear in mind when you hear about all these sort of crimes that she committed while on this ward was the fact that this hospital was so understaffed that this Children's Ward 4 would only have a maximum of 2 trained nurses patrolling, looking after patients at any given time. So 2 was a lot of nurses for this particular ward, and most of the time it would just be 1 fully trained nurse. So this kind of explains why all of the awful things that she did went unnoticed for so long. On February 21st, 1991, 7-month-old Liam Taylor had been admitted into Children's Ward 4 for a chest infection. Liam's parents had, in retrospect, said that Beverley had been the one sort of put in charge of his care, and she had, in hindsight, been quite persuasive for them to leave him in her care alone overnight, for them to go home. She made it out like at the time she just wanted them to go home, get some rest, look after themselves, and that she would keep an eye on her son. But in retrospect, like I said, they had kind of noticed how persuasive she was actually being. So when they returned the following day, she told the parents that during her first night with Liam, he had experienced some sort of respiratory emergency, but he did pull through, and she told them that it was nothing to worry about, that he was fine now. And the next night, Beverley was once again in charge of his care, but this time his parents decided to stay with him because obviously there was an emergency the night before, so they wanted to just keep an eye on him just in case anything else happened. During the night there was another emergency, but he once again pulled through, And then it wasn't long until Beverley was once again alone with him, during which time Liam suddenly turned white. He went so pale and all kind of red blotchy all over his skin. She called in for an emergency resuscitation team to be brought into Liam's room because she was worried that he was going into some sort of cardiac arrest. And it was here that her colleagues noticed that Liam hadn't been hooked up to any machines, any monitors that would have sounded an alarm if he had stopped breathing like he was supposed to. But there was no reason to sort of be suspicious on Beverley at this time, because they kind of just put it down to the lack of manpower, the lack of staff members working, so it was kind of just put down to like an honest mistake. No one had really noticed that these monitors hadn't been attached to Liam. So sadly, Liam had gone into cardiac arrest, and as a result he suffered from quite serious brain damage, and he was from this point on fully reliant on a life support machine. So it wasn't long before Liam's parents sadly had to make the excruciating decision whether to take him off life support machine, which they ultimately decided to because he was a 7-month-old on life support machine, and it wasn't an easy decision, but it was what they chose. The cause of death on Liam Taylor's death certificate was listed as heart failure, and at this point, like I said, no suspicion whatsoever was on Beverley. 2 weeks later, on March the 5th, 1991, 11-year-old Timothy Hardwick was admitted to Children's Ward 4 after suffering from an epileptic fit. Now, this was particularly troublesome because Timothy had cerebral palsy, so when he'd had this epileptic fit, his parents had brought him in obviously for concern of a larger health issue at risk. Beverley was again in charge of Timothy's care, and it didn't take long for her to be alone with him, and then she called in an emergency resus team because again he had appeared to go into cardiac arrest. Sadly, the resus team entered the room. They found him blue in the face with no pulse, and unfortunately they were unable to revive Timothy. There was no official cause of death listed, but the professionals working on kind of Timothy's case, they kind of just put it down to his epilepsy. They just said that it must have been a pure accident after he'd had a fit or something. So once again, no suspicion was on Beverley. On the 3rd of March 1991, 1-year-old Kaylee Desmond was admitted into Children's Ward 4 after suffering from a chest infection, but she had kind of, once she'd been admitted, already seemed to be recovering. She was kind of just placed there more for observation, to keep an eye on her, to make sure that her condition doesn't worsen again. 5 days after being admitted into the ward, Kaylee went into cardiac arrest, but she was able to be revived successfully, so she was totally fine. She was then transferred to a larger hospital in Nottingham because they were better equipped. I think they had just more people and more equipment to deal with this ill 1-year-old who had suddenly gone into cardiac arrest. And it was here that doctors kind of gave her a look over to make sure there was nothing else wrong with her. And this is when they discovered a really unusual puncture mark. It looked like an injection hole in her armpit, which is extremely strange, but also because she was a 1-year-old girl, they kind of just assumed that perhaps it was like an accidental injection, like she'd squirmed while someone had tried to inject her, and this was kind of put down as the reason for them finding this. They didn't think it was anything too worrying. On March 20th, 1991, 5-year-old Bradley Gibson was admitted to Ward 4 with pneumonia. He too went into sudden cardiac arrest while under Beverley's care and was also successfully saved. It was later that tests were carried out, so they did blood work on him, and they found that his insulin levels were extremely high, like worryingly high. There was no explanation for how the insulin levels could have been this stupidly high, like it was lethal, and they couldn't explain it. They said it wasn't likely to be a natural thing, but also they had no reason to suspect that someone had actually been injecting him. Beverley was later alone with Bradley again because, like I said, still no suspicion was on her at this point. And he suddenly suffered from a heart attack, and this is when he was transferred to the larger Nottingham hospital that I mentioned earlier, and he recovered successfully. And still at this point, despite the number of accidents that happened under Beverley's care, there were no reasons to suspect her as having anything to do with it, because it was kind of just a busy children's ward that was also understaffed, so no one really at this point was pointing any fingers. 5-month-old Paul Crampton had been admitted to Children's Ward 4 around the same time with a chest infection. While in Beverley's care, she had attempted to end his life by injecting a lethal amount of insulin into his system. She had tried to do so 3 times in hopes of him overdosing, but he luckily was sent to a larger Nottingham hospital because they noticed his deteriorating state, where he recovered successfully. On March 22nd, 1991, 2-year-old Hik Young Chan was found in Ward 4, blue in the face, but he had recovered after they supplied him with extra oxygen. There was another emergency in which he was then suddenly transferred to the larger Nottingham Hospital again because they were better equipped to deal with him, and he recovered successfully. However, what is really notable and really kind of threw me at this point when I read this was physicians at this particular hospital, again when they looked him over, they attributed this injury, so this sudden emergency that he had suffered in Ward 4, as being the result of a fractured skull that he had obtained after falling. Now this is so strange for a 2-year-old hospital patient under close watch to suffer from a fractured skull after falling. I can't imagine any scenario in which a 2-year-old in a hospital can just fall with that much force. But again, because they had no reason to suspect that someone had intentionally caused him this harm, they just put it down to a freak accident. Beverley's next victims were 2-month-old twins named Becky and Katie Phillips. They had been placed on the ward purely for observation because the pair of them had been born prematurely, so they were kind of keeping an eye on them just to make sure that nothing kind of came about in terms of their health. Baby Becky had suffered from a stint of gastroenteritis, and so she was placed in Beverley's care because obviously she had appeared to be kind of the more ill seeming twin. She was the one that had the most initial health problems. 2 days later, Beverley had called for an emergency resus team into baby Becky's room. She was telling the resus team that they needed to go in there because she had appeared hyperglycemic, she was cold all over, and she was worried that she was going to go into cardiac arrest. However, when the resus team arrived in baby Becky's room, they found absolutely nothing wrong with her. Like, she was absolutely fine, and so they just put it down to an honest mistake. And since they looked her over and she appeared absolutely fine, they sent baby Becky home with her mother just to spend the night at home because, like I said, nothing appeared to be wrong with her. But it was whilst she was at home that she actually cried through the night. Like, she screamed through the night and she started having convulsions. So the family called kind of like the family doctor to the home. They didn't bring her back into the hospital, they just called their kind of close doctor to the home, who said unfortunately because of her age it is likely that she was just suffering from colic. There wasn't really much they could do but kind of wait it out, sadly. However, unfortunately this diagnosis wasn't correct and baby Becky died early hours of the morning. Her twin Katie was also sadly still in the care of Beverley in the hospital, and it didn't take long for an emergency resus team to be called into baby Katie's room. They had responded to a call that Katie had stopped breathing, but she had recovered successfully by the time that they attended to her. But then sadly 2 days later she suffered from a similar emergency, following which both of her lungs collapsed. Katie was then transferred to the larger Nottingham Hospital, but this is where they discovered that her lungs had collapsed because of 5 broken ribs. And also sadly she had suffered from brain damage because of the lack of oxygen that was entering her brain. So she had suffered from a number of serious injuries, which at that point, again, they didn't know it was at the hands of Beverley Allitt. And what is kind of possibly the most ironic and heartbreaking fact to me is that baby Katie and Becky's mother was so grateful to Beverley for saving Katie that she actually asked her to be Katie's godmother, and in a really twisted manner Beverley accepted, and she was then officially Katie's godmother. So despite actually causing Katie's brain damage, a partial paralysis, she had a lot of things wrong with her because of this injury, she was her godmother. I just think that is so twisted. The next victim was 7-year-old Michael Davidson. He had been admitted into Children's Ward 4 because he had been accidentally wounded with an air gun, but it wasn't long before he was suffering from a heart attack, which obviously is completely unrelated to an air gun wound, and luckily he did survive this emergency. Christopher King was admitted around the same time. He had been suffering from really bad stomach pains, but then it didn't take long for an emergency resus team to have to revive him after he appeared blue in the face and he'd stopped breathing and he was seizing. A very similar thing happened to 8-month-old Christopher Peasgood, I think is how you pronounce his name. He was having breathing problems, and so they supplied him with extra oxygen. He appeared fine, but then he too began suddenly seizing. However, luckily both of these boys successfully recovered from these emergencies. Patrick Elstone was a 7-week-old infant. He had been admitted into Beverley's care because he was suffering from quite a serious ear infection, but he was suddenly found unconscious in his hospital room. He was successfully revived, but sadly, because of the emergency, he had suffered from quite serious brain damage. On April 22nd, 1991, 15-month-old Claire Peck was admitted into Children's Ward 4. She was suffering from quite serious asthma, and so she was needing a breathing tube to help her get oxygen into her body. A few minutes after being in Beverley's care, she suffered from a heart attack, which she was successfully revived. Under Beverley's care, she then sadly suffered from another heart attack, but sadly she could not be saved. So Claire's autopsy didn't really show anything strange, anything unusual. They kind of just pointed towards her dying of natural causes. It was kind of just like one of those freak accidents. But it was actually a consultant who wasn't working full-time in the hospital. Like I said, he was kind of like an external consultant in the hospital. It was actually him that his suspicions were raised when he kind of saw this string of unexplained cardiac arrests and high insulin levels that were kind of going on throughout Children's Ward in the last couple months since Beverley had started working there. An inquiry was launched which led to the exhumation of Claire Peck's body. They discovered something called lignocaine in her system, which is something that is very typically found in the bodies of patients who had suffered from cardiac arrest. However, it was never in any circumstances to be used in infants. It was just not supposed to be done, and so there was no rational explanation as to why they would find this in 15-month-old Claire Peck's system. There was a police superintendent working on the inquiry at the time. It was him that realised this link between each of the victims was their high insulin levels and the fact that it wasn't naturally occurring in such a high amount of children. When they looked into this kind of insulin link, they discovered that previously Beverley herself had actually reported her key to the insulin refrigerator as being missing. Record checks were conducted and they discovered a number of missing nursing logs which would actually contain all of Beverley's kind of nursing hours. So these were completely missing, and it was this that ultimately led them to Beverley's capture. In police captivity, Beverley remained calm. She maintained her innocence throughout. She claimed she had nothing to do with any of these children's deaths. So they searched her home and they actually found the missing nursing logs. And then a background check into her early life, all of the kind of behaviours that I spoke about earlier, pointed towards a very serious personality disorder. So these kind of attention-seeking behaviours pointed towards something called Munchausen syndrome and Munchausen syndrome by proxy. So Munchausen's is something, it's defined as when you inflict pain on yourself to gain attention, whereas Munchausen's by proxy is when you inflict pain on another person in order to gain attention. So these definitions kind of describe Beverley extremely well. If you think of all that information that I gave you about her behaviour from a young age, it kind of just points straight to this. Beverley continued to refuse to confess to any of her crimes, but because of all these kind of factors like the records, everything like that, they were able to charge her. So then in November of 1991, I have a list here of her charges. She was charged with 4 counts of murder, 11 counts of attempted murder, and 11 counts of causing grievous bodily harm. Her story doesn't end here. While she was awaiting her trial, she actually began rapidly losing weight, and she was then diagnosed with another mental disorder, which is anorexia nervosa. So she obviously had a lot of mental illness problems. She really needed to seek help really from a young age, and sadly she wasn't able to get any help until it was too late and she'd already caused harm on other people. She went on trial on February 15th, 1993. It lasted for around 2 months. Then on March 23rd, 1993, Beverley Allitt was charged with 13 life sentences for murder and attempted murder. However, as opposed to being sent to prison, she was sent to a place called Crampton Secure Hospital in Nottingham. So she would live out her days in this, basically it was kind of a secure health facility, so she could actually get the help that she needed. But despite yes, she did need this help, a lot of people were very unhappy with this sentencing because they believe she would live out kind of a much happier, much nicer life in this secure hospital than she would have done in prison, considering the amount of pain she caused so many children and their families. In 2005, a report was published that actually said that in total, since being incarcerated, Beverley Allitt had received a total of £25,000 in state benefits, which is outrageous. I think no matter where your stance is on whether she should be in a mental health facility or whether she should be in prison, that is outrageous. And then the last known update I have of Beverley Allitt was while she is still living out her days in this secure hospital, she developed sepsis last month. I think it was just early last month. There were some really serious doubts as to whether she would pull through and survive, and up until now, well, since then there has been no update, so we don't know what her condition is. But yeah, that is the last known update of Beverley Allitt. So that is everything I'm going to discuss. That is kind of the timeline that I'm going to talk about of Beverley Allitt's life. I feel like I don't really know what to say in this outro now, because usually in these videos I always ask you guys to like let me know your opinions down below, but obviously this one isn't like a mystery. This is just the timeline of a convicted serial killer. So let me know down below if you kind of enjoy these serial killer ones, because I know they're a slightly different perspective than the videos I usually make, and also if you have any other videos you want me to do, whether that's like other true crime ones or just non-true crime ones like uni or lifestyle, then leave them down below. Check out all of my social media, they will all be on the screen and the description, and yeah, I will see you guys tomorrow for another installment of True Crime Week. Bye.